Chorayim Tovim to everyone. My name is Nathaniel Helfgott, Rabbi Nathaniel Helfgott from Teaneck, New Jersey. I'm zooming in from Teaneck from my dining room. This is a real background. So for those sometimes who look for fake backgrounds, it's a real background. We are in the midst, of course, of the Shloshim for Rabbi Jonathan Sachs Zatzal, who had such a tremendous impact, both on the local level in his communities, as well as on the national level in the UK for the entire Jewish community, and as well as for the world of faith and religion in general, and really was made a tremendous impact and was a walking Kiddush Hashem, a walking sanctification of God's name in all his activities. This morning, we're about 1 week away from the Shloshim, and the office of the UK had asked us if we would not hold a program on the Shloshim, because there is going to be a special program, I believe, from the office of the Chief Rabbi and the office of Rabbi Sachs next Sunday. And we therefore are having our program today in commemoration of the tremendous impact that Rabbi Sachs, Zichron Livracha, had on the world as well as on many individuals. As I said, my name is Rabbi Natty Helfgott. I was the past president of the IRF, the International Rabbinic Fellowship, which is sponsoring this program. I want to thank my co-conspirator, Dr. Ilana Stein-Hain, who planned this together with me. And I want to thank our speakers today, Dr. Tamra Wright, Rabbi Shaul Robinson, Rabbanit Leah Sarna, and Mr. Gabriel Slamovits, who are going to be speaking and being introduced directly. I just want to say one thing before we start. In addition to reading many of Rabbi Sachs's works and hearing him many times over the years, I had the great pleasure of visiting England in 2003. There used to be a program that was run by the London School of Jewish Studies called Elul, which I don't think runs anymore, which in Elul they would invite people from the locals as well as some people from Chutz la UK to come and speak during the month of Elul on themes of tshuva, etc. So I was invited in September 2003, and I got off the plane. I went to the London School of Jewish Studies, and after my first lecture, I got a little note saying that the chief rabbi would like to meet with you, and there will be a car waiting for you tomorrow to meet with the chief rabbi. And in Achanami, that's what happened. Next day, I put on a tie and a suit. I hadn't really planned on doing that, but I bought one just in case, and I went to. And I was taken to the neighborhood of St. John's Wood, and there were these two beefy Israeli security guards outside of his home, and he ushered me in. We had tea, and for an hour, he asked me about what I was doing. He was asking me about all kinds of things, and it was a very wonderful conversation. And especially, we had a very intimate conversation about mental health issues, because I had written 2 years before about mental health, and Rabbi Sachs also had his own personal issues after the death of his father, and he wrote a little book which is not so famous called Celebrating Life. It's not so famous here in America, but it is a collection of many of his essays, and I have a beautiful inscription from Rabbi Sachs, and it was very, very moving to me, and we shared that bond, and and I continued. When I saw him on a couple of occasions in the next, 17 years, we occasionally would meet. It's really a tremendous loss for Am Yisrael, for the Jewish people, and for the entire world of faith and beyond. This morning, we have the great privilege to hear from different scholars, as well as people who knew Rabbi Sachs very well, on different perspectives. On his philosophical and hashkafic perspectives, as well as on the personal, as well as on the communal perspective as a leader of rabbis and a leader of a community, and in many ways a world leader. So we'd like to start this morning by hearing from Dr. Tamra Wright, who was for many, many years the Director of Academic Studies and Educator Development at the London School of Jewish Studies. She's now a curriculum advisor at Faith and Leadership, which is a program run out of Oxford University. She also continues to be involved with the London School of Jewish Studies. And it's really a pleasure to ask her to share her insights on the contributions and the perspectives and hashkafat olam of Rabbi Sacks. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Rabbi Helfgott. It really is an enormous honor to speak at this event in memory of Rabbi Sacks Zatzal. And I'm not sure if you remember, Rabbi Helfgott, but when you emailed me to ask me to speak today, you got a response almost immediately. And I'm not an inbox zero person, and I'm not famed for my rapid responses to email, but I looked it up and there were 8 minutes between receiving the email, asking if I would speak, and sending out the response saying that I would be honored to do so. So really, genuinely, thank you very, very much for that. And also, I have some prepared remarks. But in the introductory chat moments, it made me realize, first of all, that I feel very much amongst friends. And secondly, it seems to me that many, if not the majority of people with us right now, are on the other side of the pond, as we say. So I'd like to actually just reflect for a couple of minutes on the great cultural exports from Anglo Jewry to America. And I'm I might be idiosyncratic in my choices, but I'm going to tell you my top 3. And so my top 3, there are 2 people and 1 organization. One person is Dr. Aviva Gottlieb Zornberg. An organization is Limud. And of course, I really think of Rabbi Sacks as, amongst many other accolades, the most recognizable and the most iconic cultural export of Anglo Jewry, the gift of Anglo Jewry to the rest of the world. Now, I'm not British, I'm Canadian, but somehow, I've been here long enough, so I take a certain amount of pride in all 3 of those achievements. And then just a quick footnote to what you said about, and I remember when you spoke at LL in 2003, the program does continue, but we have come to rely much less on inviting international speakers and rely much more on our own local homegrown talent, of which, thank God, there's quite a lot. So yes, and this year, of course, LL was entirely online, and what will happen next year, who knows? Okay, so what I want to do is begin to think about Rabbi Sacks's contribution to philosophy and to Jewish thought. And obviously, it is much, much too soon to assess, to truly assess his contribution, not least because such a contribution cannot be measured merely on the basis of his published works. It would be at least as important, if not more so, to look at the effect that Rabbi Sacks's teaching and writings have on future generations of thinkers. And I believe that that will be a very significant impact. And I'm already aware, have been for several years, of younger scholars who are writing PhDs and very much engrossed in his work and teasing out from the vast corpus some very important philosophical and theological observations and ideas that Rabbi Sacks himself didn't necessarily have the time to explore in an extended way. So thinking about that, I would basically say, watch this space. Okay, I think we're going to see a lot more coming out. And having said that, what I'd like to do is to share with you 3 memories of Rabbi Sacks, which have been foremost in my mind in recent days, and which for me provide helpful touchstones for considering his unique contribution both to philosophy and to Jewish thought. And in the course of doing so, we might find ourselves rethinking what do we mean by philosophy. Okay, so now for a trip down memory lane. And Rabbi Helfgott, I know that you've been to Hendon. We're going to talk a little bit about Hendon. And I'm going to tell you that I first met Rabbi Sacks when I was a PhD student in the late 1980s. I was writing a dissertation on Emmanuel Levinas, and I had just moved to London. And one of my new friends who was studying for an MA at what was then called Jews College, not the London School of Jewish Studies, strongly encouraged me to audit the course on Jewish ethics that she was taking. So I looked up the address of this college in my London A to Z, and I set out for my first class. The closer I got to my destination, the more concerned I became. As I turned the corner into Albert Road and looked down this tiny street of terraced houses, I thought that there must be some mistake. Where on earth could a college be hiding in this little residential street? Well, rest assured, I found the place set back from the road and housed in a former shoe factory. The class in Jewish ethics was taught by the principal, Rabbi Dr. Jonathan Sachs. Back then, he wasn't the chief rabbi, he wasn't a professor, he wasn't a lord. In fact, he wasn't even a published author. The first of his authored books, as opposed to edited collections, did not come out until 1990. Back in the 80s, in those days, his office in the college was a small windowless room tucked away in a corner, just as the college itself was, and indeed still is, tucked away in this little corner of Hendon, northwest London. And as I found out later, his home office, the place where he did his thinking and his writing, was actually a shed at the bottom of his garden. I'm sure you can imagine what a pleasure and indeed what a privilege it was to be a part of a small group studying secular moral philosophy and contemporary Jewish ethics with Rabbi Dr. Jonathan Sachs every week for a year. And I'm sure you know enough about human nature to realize that we couldn't fully appreciate the true extent of that privilege at the time. It was still a few years before Rabbi Sachs was appointed to the chief rabbinate, and well before his teaching and writing propelled him to something resembling rock star status in the Jewish world and beyond. His first book, Tradition in a Non-Traditional Age, was published in 1990, and it was followed by some 30 further titles, an average of one per year. Impressed as we all are by this prodigious output, I'm even more intrigued by the decades that led up to it. Rabbi Sachs reportedly suffered from writer's block for 20 years. No doubt that was very frustrating and painful for him, but when I think of those years, a well-known saying comes to mind: think much, speak little, and write less. The first of those injunctions is surely the core of a philosopher's job description, which reminds me of a story my friend Professor Howard Wetstein once told me, one that I'm sure Rabbi Sachs would have appreciated. Back in the days before individual screens were a feature on long-haul flights, a philosophy professor was staring intensely at the seat in front of him. The professor's wife, who was traveling with him, asked him a question. "Shh," he replied, "can't you see I'm working?" What is a philosopher? Etymologically, as is well known, the word is derived from the Greek and means something like lover of wisdom. Rabbi Sachs was certainly an exemplar of the philosopher in that sense. In fact, the relationship between Torah and Chokhmah, between Judaism and secular wisdom, became a central preoccupation of his thoughts. He read widely and deeply, and he delighted in bringing recent developments in psychology, economics, political philosophy, sociology, and so forth into dialogue with Jewish texts and teachings. In fact, he argued that it was an imperative to do so. In The Dignity of Difference, he wrote, "Because the God of creation is also the God of revelation, there is ultimate harmony between them. Even though, given the imperfections in our understanding of both, it may not be evident at any given moment. There must, I believe, be an ongoing conversation between them, for otherwise Torah will remain a closed system with no grip, no purchase, no influence on the world outside its walls." This is the central idea that Michael Harris, Daniel Reinhold, and I drew upon when we edited Radical Responsibility, a collection of essays presented to Rabbi Sachs on the occasion of his retirement from the Chief Rabbinate in 2013. We sought contributions not only from experts in Jewish studies, but also from leading scholars in the fields of moral philosophy, leadership studies, and political philosophy, people whom Rabbi Sacks had quoted extensively in his teaching and writing. We knew we had succeeded because when he was presented with the book at the launch, he exclaimed, "I love this. It has all my heroes in it." His love of wisdom extended well beyond the realms of academic scholarship. In paying tribute to him, many people have quoted Ben Zoma's teaching that the wise person is one who learns from everyone. In his recent book, Morality, Restoring the Common Good in Divided Times, which was published only this year, we are offered a glimpse of some of the slightly lower brow reading material on his bookshelves. He wrote, "I am, I admit, a long-time devotee of self-help books. I have felt the fear and done it anyway. I have refrained from sweating the small stuff. I've experienced the life-changing magic of tidying. I know the power of now. I'm okay and you're okay. And I no longer sit worrying who moved my cheese." In this vein, what surprised me most was discovering that Rabbi Sacks had read Tim Ferriss's book, The 4-Hour Work Week, shortly after publication, and he had even recommended it to family members. For those of you who may not be familiar with it, the subtitle of this book was "Escape the 9-to-5, Live Anywhere, and Join the New Rich." Wow, I found myself wondering whether Rabbi Sacks and Lady Elaine were hoping to start an internet business and become digital nomads. Fortunately for all of us, that didn't seem to be on the cards. Rabbi Sacks's openness, and indeed his passion for identifying and absorbing new knowledge and wisdom wherever they could be found, was closely linked to other key elements of his thought. In one of his many memorable phrases, and alliterative phrases that he was so fond of, he espoused the dignity of difference. Now, the degree to which he was genuinely a theological pluralist will no doubt be debated in scholarly and religious circles for some time. But whether one takes the original version of dignity of difference, which I have on my shelf, or the revised one as the definitive text, it is clear that Rabbi Sacks espoused what I would term epistemological humility, an acute awareness that humans, by their nature, can have only a partial grasp of truth. In quite a famous passage in The Dignity of Difference, he quoted the Midrash Rabbah, which has God taking truth and throwing it to the ground. Rabbi Sacks commented, "For life to be livable, truth on earth cannot be what it is in heaven. Truth in heaven may be platonic, eternal, harmonious, radiant, but man cannot aspire to such truth, and if he does, he will create conflict, not peace. Men kill because they believe they possess the truth while their opponents are in error. In that case, says God in the Midrash, throwing truth to the ground, let human beings live by a different standard of truth, one that is human and thus conscious of its own limitations. Truth on the ground is multiple, partial. Fragments of it lie everywhere. Each person, culture, and language has part of it. None has it all. Truth on earth is not, nor can it aspire to be, the whole truth. It is limited, not comprehensive, particular, not universal. When two propositions conflict, it is not necessarily because one is true and the other false. It may be, and often is, that each represents a different perspective on reality, an alternative way of structuring order. In heaven, there is truth. On earth, there are truths. Therefore, each culture has something to contribute. And similarly, the morality book highlights a range of different types of morality that have been prominent in different cultures and different ages. Drawing on the work of a number of scholars, he looks at the contrast between the thin morality of liberal individualism and the thick morality of reverence and respect. We don't have time to go into those terms, but rest assured, those are technical philosophical terms, thick and thin. He surveys 4 broad types of moral tradition: civic ethics, the ethic of duty, codes of honor, and the morality of love. And then he discusses 3 types of moral personality: tradition-directed, inner-directed, and other-directed. But all these alternatives do not necessarily lead to the conclusion that morality is a matter of subjective choice. Rather, morality can be thought of as similar to human languages. He writes, "None of us at any given moment stands poised between the 6,000 languages spoken today, free to choose between them. We may be multilingual. We may acquire a small vocabulary to help us on a foreign trip. But for most of us, there is one language in which we think and can best express ourselves. And since language exists for the purpose of communication, and communication involves a listener as well as a speaker, we are constrained by our human environments. We need to speak in such a way as to be understood. That means that we need to live in a community of fellow speakers of the same language. We may use language to express our innermost feelings, but that language has rules of syntax and semantics, and we must obey them if we are to communicate effectively. Now, in the same way that seeing all human truth as partial enables us to value the contributions of other individuals and cultures, Rabbi Sachs argues in the Morality book that a mature understanding of the many ways there are of organizing a society and a life should make us more tolerant of the people not like us. Morality for Rabbi Sachs is a language, but it's a language of deeds. And just as we need to commit to speaking a recognizable human language if we want to be understood, we also need to commit to a morality, a language of deeds, if we want to find meaning, depth, and resonance in our lives. Out of the many varieties of morality available, there is one that is ours, and we do not have to denigrate the others to make that one our own. This is one of the key ideas that we find in many places in his work. I can be steadfastly and passionately committed to my faith, my truth, my moral perspective, without the need to delegitimate or denigrate that of others. Leadership scholar Ronald Heifetz, one of the contributors to Radical Responsibility, uses the metaphor of getting on the balcony. The metaphor is that of a ballroom. By leaving the dance floor and retreating to a place where one can observe the action and look for patterns, a leader can take a step back and ask, what's really going on here? I believe that Rabbi Sachs was particularly skilled at getting on the balcony. The subtitles of some of his most important works, How to Avoid the Clash of Civilizations, Confronting Religious Violence, Restoring the Common Good in Divided Times, amongst others, are indicative of the way in which he was able to look to the bigger picture of what was going on, both in the Jewish world and in contemporary society. I also think that his dual commitment to and deep immersion in both Torah and secular wisdom provided him with vantage points from which each could be used to gain insight into the other. Going to the balcony and looking at Judaism as just one of the many faiths on the dance floor enabled him to embrace pluralism without in any way diluting his own Torah commitments. The second memory that I wanted to share is a story that will no doubt be familiar to many of you. Rabbi Sachs often spoke about a transformational journey he undertook as an undergraduate, traveling to America to meet with some of the leading rabbis of the generation and to put his questions to them. As I have read and reread some of his writings in the last few weeks, I've come to appreciate that familiar story in a different way. I believe that one of Rabbi Sachs's great gifts as a teacher and writer is that he never forgot what it was like to be that young, questioning student, nor did he ever lose sight of how crucial young people are to the Jewish future. It seems to me that when Rabbi Sachs sought to articulate Jewish ideas, he was always conscious that any arguments that he put forward would need to bear up to the scrutiny of a younger generation exposed to a wide range of influences, from deconstruction and postmodernism to the latest trends on social media. The final memory that I want to share with you is from the TED conference in Vancouver in April 2017. Sadly, I wasn't actually there, but I had done the next best and much cheaper thing, and I had booked tickets for a cinema screening of the talks. We had been told that Rabbi Sachs would be the first speaker, but there was a late change to the program, and in fact, he spoke last. And what a finale it was. You may have seen the talk online. It has been viewed over 2 million times, and not all of those were me in the last 2 weeks preparing for this talk. But there are two things you wouldn't know unless you'd been there or you'd seen the sort of simulcast in the cinema. First, from the moment Rabbi Sachs took to the stage, it was clear that this talk was going to be different. Unlike all of the other speakers, he had no props, no audio visuals, no shtick, as it were, just the power of his personality, his voice, and his message. And it was a message that had needed to be very carefully crafted indeed, because TED is explicitly not a forum for talking about religion. The second thing that we were able to observe in the cinema that is not obvious on the YouTube video is the reaction of the audience. And Joanna Benarosh, who runs Rabbi Sachs's office, was very helpful to me despite being so busy this past week. And I shared with her what I remembered and what I had observed watching this film in the cinema, and she reinforced my memory of it. So what I have to say comes with the authority also of Joanna, to whom I'm very grateful for her inputs. And I want to also add, I scribbled a note, Rabbi Helfgott, when you were speaking about putting on a suit and tie to go visit the chief rabbi, that TED has a more relaxed dress code. And Joanna said, they asked him, they said, everything in your talk at the rehearsal is wonderful, Rabbi Sachs, but would you please lose the tie? And Rabbi Sachs responded by saying, I've looked at every element of the dress code and I am complying. I'm not wearing dangly earrings and this whole list of other things he's not doing, but basically the tie stays. So it was actually, part of the kind of iconography of the image that you had of this man in a suit with a beard and a large kippah taking to the TED stage after all the kind of pyrotechnics of the fantastic talks that we saw. They were each was a masterpiece of its type, but you could just feel the kind of anticipation in the audience of what is this rabbi in a suit going to tell us? What is he going to say? Okay. So what I want to talk about is the second thing is the reaction of the audience. Unsurprisingly, and we're all familiar with Rabbi Sachs's strengths as an orator and the jokes that he tells and the way he gets people to come along with him. So unsurprisingly, within a minute or two, he had them eating out of his hands. And the standing ovation he received as he finished was clearly genuine. Again, I checked this out with Joanna. They didn't do that for everybody. The standing ovation was a real sign that the audience had indeed been deeply moved. Now, I'm not going to tell you what he said. That's your homework. You can watch the video. But I will conclude with two brief ideas about what philosophy in general and Jewish philosophy in particular should be. We've already talked about Rabbi Sachs as a deep thinker who embodied the love of wisdom. But I haven't yet described the task of a specifically Jewish philosopher. And for that, I turn to the work of Emmanuel Levinas, a thinker whom Rabbi Sachs admired greatly, although he never became a self-possessed Levinasian. Levinas taught that philosophy needs to transcend the love of wisdom and to become, in his phrase, the wisdom of love at the service of love. And according to Levinas, the specific task of Jewish philosophy is to translate the Bible into Greek, to convey the ethical teaching of Judaism in a universal language accessible to all. Rabbi Sachs's TED Talk, like so much of his remarkable body of work, is a masterclass in precisely that. That April night in the cinema, I was reminded that it is not only teachers who take great pride in their best students, but the reverse is also true.
Thank you so much, Dr. Wright. Just to get a sense of the range that Rabbi Sachs gave to this world, to begin with his positions in philosophy, and to move now to the way that he guided rabbis and British Jewry. I just want to share that back when Rabbi Sachs came to Lincoln Square Synagogue, where I was working about a decade ago, we really could feel come to life the Rashi on yesterday's Parsha, talking about when a tzaddik comes to the town, hu ziva hu hadara. He was glowing. It was splendor that he brought to the table. So I'm Alana Steinhain, and I had the pleasure of meeting Rabbi Sachs while working with Rabbi Shaul Robinson, who is our next speaker, to talk about a different side of Rabbi Sachs, how the philosopher came down to earth and talked to people about how they run their communities and how to be an incredible rabbi. So, Rabbi Robinson.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Dr. Steinhain, and thank you, Rabbi Helfgott. And really, I so enjoyed listening to Dr. Tamra Wright's presentation, and brought back so many memories and so many of those, the little shtetl of Hendon and the amongst the huddled small homes, the luminary, or Hagola, if you like, really shone a light. And even though I started saying that line humorously, I ended actually with a tear, because it's actually extraordinarily difficult to imagine that Rabbi Jonathan Sachs, Zecher Tzadik Livracha, is no longer with us. And all our easy assumptions that there would be more opportunities, not, to come to America, to inspire, to uplift, to let us see the best in ourselves, to take pride in ourselves and our institutions, in our careers, and know that whatever the challenges that were coming, and there will be profound challenges in the years ahead, there would be more books that would anticipate, address, and lead. And to know that that is not true anymore is just devastating on the most communal and the most personal ways. And I really appreciate the opportunity to be able to speak, and very much like Tamra, I unusually replied to the invitation, probably not within 7 minutes, but I've accepted to speak whenever I've been asked about Rabbi Sachs, not because I in any sense claim to be the closest or the most intimate or anything, quite the opposite. But being a rabbi in the United Synagogue and being privileged to spend time and have conversations both in London and in America, and indeed in Cambridge, memorably, were profoundly important experiences. And the last comment that Dr. Steinhain and Alana made, remember when he walked into Lincoln Square Synagogue, there was, as you described, Tamra, about the TED Talk, there was a presence, a charisma, an excitement, that there was something here that was extraordinary, special. Now, we've all had charismatic speakers speak in our institution, and we hope that charismatic speakers go hand in hand with content. And here's a phenomenal thing about Rabbi Sachs, that he never traded a moment his intellectual honesty or his truth to power for scrap of popularity. Often, in fact, as we know from history of Anglo Jewry, you mentioned the book, The Dignity of Difference, and its philosophical contribution, without in any way alluding to the extraordinary eruptions that brought about. And Rabbi Sachs was an individual who I want to say, and I won't say that he was fearless, because I am sure he had his questions and his doubts, but he was an individual of extraordinary courage. And I'm not qualified to speak about his philosophical contribution, but I can speak, first of all, and just very briefly, as a rabbi, seeing the impact that Rabbi Sachs was making on the wider Jewish world. And if you look and you alluded to this, Tamra, but the oeuvre of his books, many of his books, not just, of course, the great Torah that he was producing over these last few years, and a question that at least I've heard some people discussing, how much of his commentary in the Chumash was written, how much of it was completed. I reached out to Joanna over the course of the summer and asked that Rabbi Sachs address our community over Zoom. And I was told that he is really far behind on his Chumash commentary and is really trying to get ahead of it. And it would be a tragedy, if not enough was written in order to be published. What a loss that would be. But going back to the books that he was impacting on the wider world, and you alluded to this, not just questions of restoring the common good, but I'm just looking around actually my bookshelf. Not in God's Name, a statement about religious violence and fundamentalism, the great partnership, religion and science, in areas where not just Judaism, but religion felt itself to be on retreat. And here, arguably this week in America, religion won, quote unquote, a victory, a deeply unpopular victory, let's say, in many people's eyes. Rabbi Sacks was not interested in asserting the rights of religion. He was interested in expressing the beauty and the contribution and the everlasting, eternal use of religion. And I don't know where precisely, whether it was book 2 or book 3, but when I first encountered Rabbi Sacks, when I happened to be working at Jews College as it then was, and I took a few months off yeshiva, and I was working for the Jewish Educational Development Trust, and it was right in those months, Rabbi Sacks had been invited to deliver the Wreath Lectures, a tremendous honor in British intellectual life. And from that came this book, The Persistence of Faith, where even in 1990, he was writing about the fact that religion was a force that would refuse to die out, even in a secular world, and should be looked at as something that had something beautiful and meaningful and eternal and useful to contribute. And so many of his books, the way that he became an intimate of Gordon Brown, the British Prime Minister, the way that he was prepared to debate Richard Dawkins, the fiercest of the Oxford, if I may, atheists and anti-religion voices. And he was personally invested in the idea that religion had, not just Judaism, and not just in a narrow sense of sectarianism, but the religion was a voice that must not be allowed to die out. And that was true not just in the philosophical and the public sphere as well. Think about some of his last contributions to the standing in the Jewish community. Last year's Slichot address, I believe, at Hampstead Synagogue, and happy 25th anniversary to Rabbi Harris on cancel culture. A seminal phrasing within our world of tshuva and second chances, a deep assessment and indeed warning of trends in the secular world or the outside world or our world that threaten to undermine so much of what we hold on to. And countless examples of that. Rabbi Sacks was an individual who gave us all a sense of tremendous pride and awareness of the dignity of our tradition, the dignity of Judaism, so that no rabbi could ever be afraid, need ever be afraid and get up and assert that Judaism is relevant. When listening to Rabbi Sacks, I remember something that Stanley Getzler, a member of our community, thank God well into his 90s, who was a member of the Lincoln Square Synagogue since the earliest days. Rabbi Riskin ascended to the pulpit in those days in the apartment, probably in front of 30, 40 people, and it must have been Parshas Tazria or something impossible like that. And Rabbi Riskin said, my job is to make this relevant to you. And if I cannot make this meaningful, then I've no right to be a rabbi. And I often thought of that line that I heard many years ago from Stanley Getzler listening to Rabbi Sacks, because he made ordinary Jews in the pews, as well as philosophers and professors and princes and prime ministers, look at the Bible, look at not just the Bible, look at the rabbinic tradition and say, this is meaningful and this is relevant. A few words about the Rabbinit, and then I'll hand over the baton. Rabbi Sacks was chief rabbi, and the chief rabbinate, and Lana and I worked once with a very fine associate rabbi who wrote a history of the chief rabbinate, Rabbi Dr. Ben Elton. The chief rabbinate of the British Commonwealth is an institution like many others. Many people in office choose to exert tremendous power through office and stamp their authority on office. in many ways, the least important thing about Rabbi Sacks was that he was the chief rabbi. Because, and I say that with all due respect, because he was not an individual who was interested in using the tremendous power that that office brings. It's possible, thinking at the beginning, that he tried to, and he started various organizations, Jewish Continuity and others. My father-in-law was the recipient of the very first ever Chief Rabbi Award for Excellence for the work that he did in the Pinner community. So Chief Rabbi, certainly in the beginning years of the Chief Rabbinit and the great community, found himself, if you like, falling over his own feet in terms of British community politics, setting up an organization to fund and to incentivize excellence, and then bringing right into the crazy world of community politics. Can you fund reform institutions? Can you fund gay institutions, etc.? And I get the impression after a few years, he lost interest in trying to mold the chief rabbinate to his image. And of course, Limud was not a fight that he was really interested in. Everybody knew what he really felt about Limud, but he wasn't really interested in using his office to assert his power on that. Really quite the opposite. As well as many of the incredible distinctions that Rabbi Sacks made, and Tamra mentioned one of them, one that stays with me so long. The American Jewish community, modern Orthodox Jewish community would have done well to remember the distinction, as the last few years, and I say this more or less not in a partisan way, as many of us rush to embrace the access to power that we uniquely had these last few years, Rabbi Sacks insisted that despite the well-known man, Malke, who are true royalty, Rabbanan, the rabbis, and certainly the chief rabbi, Rabbi Sacks insisted that influence was much, much more important, certainly in the long run, than power. He rarely asserted power, and he rarely tried to use his closeness to power. Instead, he felt that a moral voice and standing and stature gives rabbis and communities in Judaism extraordinary influence over public debates and public moments that was much more likely to provide long-term benefit and be a long-term blessing. As a rabbi working under the chief rabbi, rabbis have their moments and self-doubts. I spoke to the students of Yeshivat Commemorating Torah. I won't repeat what I said then the other week. But rabbis have their struggles and they have their challenges. And working under, and I would say even a chief rabbi like Rabbi Sacks, who increasingly became a spokesman of Judaism to the outside world, meant that you were only ever a phone call away. And you would phone up, Simma Weinberg, should be well, and you would get to see the chief rabbi, and you would get an hour of one-on-one chizuk. You would go to St. John's Wood, you would go to the house, and you were Hamilton Terrace, and you had far cry from the crooked pebblestone of Hendon, and you would get this extraordinary encouragement and belief and warmth. And I've made this point before. When you encounter rabbis, especially world-leading rabbis, and indeed world-leading academics, it is often that you are left feeling inadequate. You walk away saying, well, I'll never be that brilliant. What I got when I finally managed to spend time with that individual was a tutorial on why I am not as brilliant as the person who spared me the time. With Rabbi Sacks, it was opposite. He made everybody, crazy as it may sound, believe that we were just as capable of giving extraordinary speeches, building extraordinary communities, writing wonderful books. He never for a moment made anybody feel, I'm me, and you get to watch. You're privileged to be able to be allowed to be close. And that was really extraordinary. It's a model. And the very last thing that I'll say is that, and this is partly part of the trajectory that ended up in me leaving the United Kingdom, and I mean this in a good way, and coming to the United States. I was part of, in the British Rabbinate, when Jews College already had become London School of Jewish Studies, and then stopped being an academic institution, and its future was on the was sort of on the table. So there was an official organized part of the United Synagogue, and I'm not here talking about it. This wouldn't even be a footnote in anybody's history of the United Synagogue, the chief rabbinate, but I say the following, that there was an institutional takeover planned of the London School of Jewish Studies. We were going to call it, I think, Kehillah College, and it was basically going to be run by the central bodies of Anglo Jewry to do something or other. It was snatched away from under our noses by this brilliant cadre of young, exciting, academic, committed people. Tamra Wright, Rafi Zarim, Mark Weinberg, Oliver Shalom, Sammy Rubin. And these were individuals. Why do I mention this? Because every rabbi, and certainly in the British Rabbinate, would look at the problem of young, enthusiastic, skeptical, and I mean that in a particular way, skeptical, open-minded people who could possibly be assets in a community, but ask bigger questions and have a bigger reach and are frankly smarter and more learned than many, many rabbis. And so much of the rabbinate is defensive. It's defensive. How do you deal with the challenge of young, bright people who challenge, just by their very existence, the stature of the rabbi, or certainly make the rabbi feel challenged? Rabbi Sachs's model, and he told me this when I came to America, because I knew that at Lincoln Square Synagogue, there were going to be people exactly like that. And he said, never look at people like this as a challenge, as people are going to be able to get you, or people you're going to be self-conscious about speaking. Embrace them, encourage them, and empower them. And the real proteges, the real Talmidim of Rabbi Jonathan Sachs are not pulpit rabbis, although we gained so much from him. But there is 2, maybe 3 generations of brilliant people, promising people, Rafi, Tamra, Sam Liebens in Israel, and many, 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 many others who he raised up, who he encouraged, who he believed in, who he treated as no less special than rabbis, and who created individuals who will have generations of impact on the Jewish community to come. So his impact is something that not just academically, as Tamra said, but in terms of the impact of people in an extraordinary range of institutions will have influence for decades over the Jewish people, is something that, please God, hopefully, and it's a comfort for us at this time, we will be nana, will get the benefit from in the many, many years to come. Thank you.
Wow, how incredibly beautiful. And I couldn't think of a better segue to our upcoming speaker, who is Rabbanit Leah Sarna, the Associate Director of Education and Director of High School Programs at Drisha. And we've invited Rabbanit Sarna to talk about exactly that. As someone who is, L'chol banayach limudei Hashem v'am shlom banayach, people who are the new bonim and the new bonot, what Rabbi Sachs's teachings and legacy and presence means to her and so many of her peers. So please, Rabbanit Sarna.
Thank you so much. So as Dr. Steinhain mentioned, I was asked to speak about the impact that Rabbi Sachs had on me as a young person of faith. I do want to mention that I wasn't personally close to Rabbi Sachs particularly. So unlike the previous 2 speakers, I'm more speaking about maybe the experience of living in a world that was kind of built by Rabbi Sachs. He became chief rabbi the year I was born. So that's kind of just to situate myself within this. I love that this event is called a Majestic Torah, because that's exactly my first memory of Rabbi Sachs. I was growing up in Boston, a student at the Maimonides school, and we knew that in theory, rabbis could be majestic. Rabbi Soloveitchik's desk was in the library, his stender was in the front of the shul, but the Rav passed away when I was 2 years old. So I had excellent teachers at Maimonides, but we didn't stand up when they walked into the room, and we did not treat them like royalty. I remember exactly where I was. I was sitting in room 2 after tefillah one morning when a teacher explained to us that Rabbi Sachs was coming to visit the school. He was chief rabbi at the time, and it, of course, caught all of our attention that he had been knighted, a real-life knight coming to visit the school. How thrilling. And I personally was also interested because my Saba and Safta grew up in London, and my Saba had both studied and taught at Jews College. His sister, Ruth Royd, was the first woman to graduate from Jews College, and I knew that Rabbi Sachs had led the institution, which, as you've heard, is now the London School of Jewish Studies. My high school teacher taught us to stand up when he walked in, and we literally practiced. I remember so vividly. The door would open, we all stood up, and then the teacher taught us how to kind of navigate that tricky moment of when to know when to sit down, which is, never quite clear. Later, the whole middle and upper school gathered into the shul, and we heard from Rabbi Sachs. He told us about how he came to visit the Rav in 1968 when he was young and in search of direction. As Rabbi Sachs wrote about that visit in A Judaism Engaged with the World, quote, Rabbi Slamovits challenged me to think. And Rabbi Sachs was paying that challenge forward to the students at the Maimonides School. That was his main message to us, to think, to learn widely and deeply in all of our classes and in every subject. But Rabbi Sachs told us about another meeting he had on that same trip, a meeting with the Lubavitcher Rebbe, and reminded us, as he reminded many, many students in all different venues over the course of his career, that thinking alone is insufficient. It should be combined with leadership. Rabbi Sachs encouraged everyone towards leadership, men and women alike. I did not ever feel that he was only speaking to the men in the room. And when I was exactly that same juncture in my life, at the end of my time as an undergraduate, I too went on a little bit of a Rabbi Sachs inspired tour. And that's, of course, when I first met Dr. Stein-Hain and the other women leaders of the American Orthodox community at the time. I received a copy of Rabbi Sachs's A Letter in the Scroll as a senior in high school. This is the very one. And I read it hungrily. I have my copy with highlights and notes from the first time I ever read it when I was 17. This is a line that stuck with me, motivating my Jewish leadership as well as volunteer work that animated much of my undergraduate career, which was spent fighting homelessness in New Haven. Rabbi Sachs writes, Judaism begins not in wonder that the world is, but in protest that the world is not as it ought to be. It is in that cry, that sacred discontent, that Abraham's journey begins. At the heart of reality is a contradiction between order and chaos, the order of creation and the chaos we create. There is no resolution to this conflict at the level of thought. It can be resolved only at the level of action, only by making the world other than it is. This again touches at that balance between action and thought. Thought helps us to recognize the chaos, to ask the right questions about it, to dig deeper. But it turns out that the more you learn, the more chaos you find, both in Torah and in every other intellectual pursuit. But we can come to terms with that chaos. Rabbi Sachs further wrote, and 17-year-old Leah further highlighted, faith is born not in the answer, but in the question, not in harmony, but in dissonance. Thought, education, and scholarship lead you to see the chaos and the questions, but those very questions then lay at the very heart of faith. Questions are not the end of the line, and they're not a breaking point. They're the center of it all. Judaism, as articulated by Rabbi Sachs, calls for more than that. It calls for sacred discontent, action, protest. But what kind of action? For Rabbi Sachs, in the tradition of virtue ethics established by Aristotle, carried forward by the Rambam and many others through to Sir Bernard Williams, Rabbi Sachs's doctoral advisor, actions originate in virtuous character. And I'll caveat this whole section to say that Professor Wright and other scholars can say so much more about how he's understood amongst the field of philosophers. This is just the sliver of his thought that's been important to me. In A Letter in the Scroll, he wrote, Judaism from its earliest days understood the way character is formed as a series of outward movements, from family to community to people to humanity as a whole. Rabbi Sachs explored this idea further in many places, including his most recent book called Morality, where he wrote in the introduction, a free society is a moral achievement, and it is made by us and our habits of thought, speech, and deed. Without self-restraint, without the capacity to defer the gratification of instinct, And without the habits of heart and deed that we call virtues, we will eventually lose our freedom. These notions of character stemming from thought, building to habit, relationship, action, and eventually a well-balanced polity motivated my undergraduate studies in philosophy, psychology, and political theory, and ultimately led to my decision to pursue positions of leadership in the Jewish community. Change starts at home, by constant work on my own character, radiating outwards to my family, my local community, the Jewish community, and the world. The question for me was never what work I wanted to pursue. That has always been the work of Abraham, the work that Rabbi Sacks characterized as making the world other than it is. The question was only, from what perch? Where do I want to sit while pursuing that work? It can be done at any and every level. So then how do I use my skills and my interests to maximize my impact? Rabbi Sacks modeled that Jewish communal leaders can speak to the whole world. Not only can we motivate other Jews to take moral action, but that the wisdom of our ancient and precious Jewish texts can speak compellingly and urgently to the nations of the world. Until this past summer, I worked at a synagogue in Chicago called Anshe Shalom B'nai Israel, ASBI. Our synagogue was unfortunately attacked a year and a half ago. And when this happened, I was contacted by an editor at The Atlantic who asked me to write about it. I wrote up the Dvar Halacha that I had given between Mincha and Mariv on the day after the attack. It was a reflection on the first Mishnah in Bava Kama. I mentioned this to a colleague of mine and his jaw fell open. The Atlantic published your Dvar Halacha, and other rabbis posted on Facebook, whoa, Bava Kama in the Atlantic. But Rabbi Sacks taught us that the wisdom of our tradition can speak to the whole world. I grew up in a world shaped by Rabbi Sacks, so I never doubted that readers of the Atlantic might be interested in the Avot Nezikin, and in fact they were. The loss of Rabbi Sacks is a tragedy and leaves behind a gaping hole in the English-speaking diaspora in particular. He taught us that Jewish leadership was majestic, to be honored by Jews and Gentiles alike. He gave us confidence in our tradition, that the depths of our Torah could speak in a beautiful language and rich values to the whole world. But take heart, because as Rabbi Sacks was wont to say, good leaders create followers, great leaders create leaders. Rabbi Sacks was a great leader and he inspired generations. And all at the same time,
thank you, everyone. I want to just, again, as the executive director of the IRF, thank Rabbi Helfgott and Dr. Stein-Hain for their work on this program and all the previous speakers. And it's actually in the role of the IRF privilege to call our next speaker, who has been an amazing partner from the lay leadership side of the IRF and reaching out to a younger generation. And that is Gabe Slamovits, who is the chair of our young leadership division and is also a lawyer graduating from NYU Law as well as NYU College, and in his role as president of NYU Hillel, and since later as the founder of the Downtown Minyan, which is a community of young professionals in Lower Manhattan, had been a long time admirer of Rabbi Sacks from afar, but had the unique opportunity to learn with him when Rabbi Sacks was a professor in residence at NYU. So Mr. Slamovits had the opportunity to learn with him, from him, and to collaborate with him on many elements of student life at NYU. Without further ado, I turn it over to Gabe Slamovits.
Thank you, Rabbi Herman. So when I was a post-high school yeshiva student, we had this phenomenon where a bookseller would routinely come to our yeshivot, and we would buy the standard text that we needed for our shiurim, our classes, our gemaras, whatever it was. And then, along with all the other new time Jewish book buyers, we would look to see what else was out there. We looked for something extra that might be interesting to us. And I, on one occasion, asked my Rosh Yeshiva if he had any suggestions. He looked around the room, picked up a copy of Rabbi Sacks's The Persistence of Faith, which Rabbi Robinson mentioned earlier, and said something to the effect of, "I think you'll enjoy his thinking." Oh, how right he was. Rabbi Sacks quickly became my rabbinic intellectual hero. I loved the vision of Judaism that he presented, a vision he would later describe as a Judaism engaged with the world. I voraciously read his writings, spellbound by his clear explanations that combined deep insights into the world of Torah and Jewish thought with the writings of thought leaders in so many other disciplines. And I began to regularly cite him in classes I taught at NYU's Hillel, the Bronfman Center, and papers that I wrote for school and casual conversations. And the first time I cited him at NYU in a Sudash Lishit Dvar Torah, people came over to me and they thought it was so exotic that I was quoting a current European chief rabbi. They wanted to know how I heard of him. Did I read other chief rabbis? Well, I guess, do they write in English? That sense. And it's been fascinating to see how someone who, for many Americans, myself included, once seemed so exotic that I had to be alerted to his existence, became the address, the spokesman for world Jewry. And more than anything, I wanted to meet him. And then it happened. He joined NYU. Now, it's rare that one gets to meet one's heroes, and rarer still that one gets to forge a relationship with them. And I am profoundly grateful that I was able to do that when he joined the faculty at NYU. But perhaps the rarest element of this might be that he lived up to my impossible expectations. Because before our first meeting, I actually Googled meeting your hero, just to get a sense of perspective, right? And when you meet your hero, according to Rav Google, it's apparently always very disappointing. They become too human. Their teachings perhaps mean less to you as a result. They don't care for you the way you care for them. How could they? How could they live up to your expectations? But this did not worry me, because modern Orthodox Jews are trained to see our heroes as human. And his type of Torah interpretation lends itself to that. We look to the Avot not as perfect messengers of the divine, but as humans. We learn from their strengths, we learn from their weaknesses. One of his essays on Parshat Lech Lecha was devoted to this very theme. In his words, Torah makes an absolute distinction between earth and heaven, God and human beings, because God is God, there is space for humans to be human. And so I was prepared to greet him as a human. And with all that, he exceeded every expectation. And that's what I want to speak about this morning. The perspective of someone who had the chance to know him personally, to witness him up close in the post-chief rabbinate phase of his career, what NYU's Rabbi Joe Wolfson has called the American phase. And there are two themes that I'd like to focus on this morning, and the way he, or this afternoon rather, and the way he expressed those themes to me and to the broader NYU community. The first is the preciseness, the precision of his language, and the second is his flexibility and his adaptability. One of the elements that makes his work so appealing to such a broad audience is Rabbi Sachs's mastery of language. To Rabbi Sachs, precision of language was not a side point. It was not a hecha timtza. It was not a way of getting to the point. Precision of language was the point. In this, he was following the tradition of the Rambam and Rav Soloveitchik. The Rambam felt that theological mistakes are made when language isn't precise. Over and over again, especially in his commentaries to the Siddur and to the Chumash, he pointed out how form mirrored content. In his Understanding Jewish Prayer, he wrote that patterns in prayer were, quote, not mere aesthetic conventions. In Judaism, there is a matching of form to content, structure to substance, that the Siddur comes from the word order, because like a choral symphony, it has movements, each with its moods, its unfolding themes, its developmental logic. 3 years ago, in a Parsha commentary he wrote to the Torah, he said, style, that in the Torah, style mirrors substance. Style mirrors substance. The way something is said is often connected to what is being said. At the end of my first extended meeting with Rabbi Sachs, I asked him to sign a copy of my Siddur. But it wasn't the Koren, because before the Koren came out, he had written a translation commentary to the Siddur that was not available in the US, only in England. And when my college roommate went to study at NYU London, I asked him to bring one back for me so that I could learn from it. And so it was this Siddur that I asked Rabbi Sachs to sign. Gave it to him, big smile on his face. Ah, this is a much better nusach. Now, you could think it is a shtick, right? British chief rabbi, British Siddur. Okay, so I said to him, what's much better about it? And he got very excited, and he gave me several examples, two of which changed the way I pray daily, both in what I say and how I think about the prayer. He said, if you look at the korbanot of the structure of the korbanot as it appears in the Nusach Anglia Siddur, meaning the Nusach of England, you'll see that it's just very simple. 3 sections. The korbanot from Bamidbar and Vayikra, immediately followed by the Mishnayot and Zvachim, followed by the Baraita of Rabbi Shmuel, which the Rambam in the first halacha of Hilchat Talmud Torah said, Zehu Nikra Gemara. This is called Gemara. So the structure is Mishnah, Mikra, Talmud. Torah, Mishnah, Gemara, which he has both written about and spoken about. By contrast, in Art Scroll or Koran or any standard Nusach Ashkenaz Siddur that we use here, everything he said, everything gets thrown in. There's Gemara Yerushalmi, there's Gemara, there's all sorts of things out of order. And he said, and it loses the structure, loses the beauty. And he was so devoted to this concept that he said there are certain things in the Siddur when he looks at them that make him, and this is a quote, feel a little ill whenever he has to think about it. Second example was that in Nusach Ashkenaz Siddurim, there's a prayer in Shacharit that's printed as follows: L'hakdish liot saram benachat ruach, b'safa v'ra v'nima, kedusha kulam kechad onim v'yamrim. That we say it with serene speech and sweet melody, all as one say kedusha. Whereas Rabbi Sachs said, and I remember him saying this, it should be obvious to anyone who's listening to the music of the prayer that it's a set of 3 two-word phrases: benachat ruach, b'safa v'ra, uve'ne'ima kedosha. Not v'ne'ima kedusha, uve'ne'ima kedosha. And I have never been able to look at the prayer the same way again. The movement of a single diacritical mark from U to O. That mark was not merely the difference between one tradition and another to Rabbi Sachs. He repeated it, that the loss of structure, the loss of beauty made him feel ill. To Rabbi Sachs, we constantly had to ask the question, why is it written this way? Why not another way? When I once asked his chief of staff, Joanna, if we could use a draft of his new Chumash for the Parsha on a Shabbat he was speaking at the downtown Minyan that I co-founded, she asked him, and his response was that it was at a stage where some academic proofreaders had made certain changes to the translation, and they had taken the poetry out of it. The poetry, the structure, the way the words were said, that was what mattered. The form lent meaning to the content. The style mirrored the substance. And the Siddur, he said to me on our walk back to Washington, to his Washington Square West apartment, was Masechet Emunah, the Tractate of Faith. In a 2009 shir at YU, he asked a question rooted in the book Menachem Kellner, Must a Jew Believe Anything? Why does the Gemara have no Masechet Emunah? Why does it have no Tractate of Faith? And he said that Chazal were very fastidious in the way they divided their literature. If you want to know halacha, look in the Gemara, look in the Mishnah. You want to know how halacha comes from Torah, look at the Midrash Halacha. You want to understand the meaning of Torah, exegetical reflection, look at Midrash Haggadah. And if you want to discover faith, Masechet Emunah, look at the Siddur, because we daven our Emunah. He wrote, we do not analyze faith, we pray it. We do not philosophize about truth, we sing it. For Judaism, theology becomes real when it becomes prayer. We do not talk about God, we talk to God. And that, he said, is what is meant when God describes us as ma'aminim, b'nei ma'aminim, that a Jew is someone of emunah, a Jew is someone who knows how to daven. He practiced what he preached. When he retired from the chief rabbinate, he was asked why he'd almost never written about his previous battles with cancer. And his answer was that his life was in God's hands, that it was God's decision, and that, and this is a quote, there was no test of faith at any point, just those simple moments at which to say, B'yado afkid ruchi, in his hand I place my soul. That was his thought. And since we say that every day in Adon Olam, he said, I didn't feel the need to write a book about it. That's emunah. To my second point, flexibility and adaptability. You know, when we ask what makes a thinker a classic, what makes a thinker become so part of the Jewish intellectual heritage that we can't imagine living without it, it's good to turn to our previous heroes. And for many of us, the greatest is the Rambam. Of course, like Rabbi Sachs, he had tremendous breadth of knowledge, philosophical depth, and as I've noted above, was finely attuned to language. Isidore Twersky, in his Introduction to Maimonides' Code, wrote about this and attributed it to a very specific quality of Rambam. Listen how Professor Jacob Dienstag summarizes this aspect and see how the broader concept can apply to Rabbi Sachs. As a pedagogue per excellence, Maimonides was deeply concerned not only about language, Hebrew or Aramaic, but also about style. It was Maimonides' flexible style that enabled him to write with precision and brevity. He points out that Maimonides was flexible enough to write his Mishnah Torah into Hebrew, unlike all of his other works written in Aramaic, That flexibility and adaptability was a hallmark of Rabbi Sacks's nature, particularly in his American phase. And I believe that during his time in New York, from his base in Washington Square, his flexibility enabled him to embrace the role of a university professor, which was quite a different role than chief rabbi. He himself, when retiring, said that when you're no longer captain of the team, you are much more able to express yourself as an individual. The first time I asked him a question was not our extended conversation. I was walking him out of a lecture he'd given at the university, and I posed a question to him, a challenge to something he'd written years ago. And his initial answer to me, in fact, his initial two answers to me, left me unsatisfied. They were practical answers, actually quite good advice. But I don't think I conveyed in that first brief conversation that I was looking for the rationale to understand his thinking more deeply. I felt for those few moments that I was getting the answer of the chief rabbi, a political figure who had departed that role only a few months prior. And then I asked again, and he stopped walking, and he said, "Which book?" And then he told me that his thinking on that particular matter had evolved. Why that had happened, he said, was a long story. And I got the sense that he wasn't pushing me off. It really was a long story. And the long story was the bulk of what we talked about in our first extended conversation a year later. He was candid. He told deeply personal stories of his own experiences in the Rabbinit. He entertained challenges to the paradigms he presented in response to my queries. And of course, his thinking was erudite, filled with references to the Rambam, Torah, and numerous recently published books. During the course of our conversation, a point by Professor Carol Gilligan came up. And I knew who she was because she had been one of my mother's favorite professors at Harvard, and she encouraged me to attend one of her lectures at NYU so as not to miss her. And I found her riveting. So when Rabbi Sacks asked me whether I was familiar with the Harvard psychologist Carol Gilligan, whose book, In a Different Voice, had been fundamental to his own thinking, I said not only that I was, but that she, like he, was now a professor at NYU. She was at the law school. A sea change came over his face, and he said, "Really? She's here? I have to meet her. I'll have to look her up." His excitement was palpable. He was excited to learn more. And working with his chief of staff, I set them up for a lunch date, which ultimately led to a dialogue between them at the 92nd Street Y. The excitement about meeting one of his heroes, to continue learning from her, to challenge his hard-won thoughts. That was Rabbi Sacks. You see this in his Divrei Torah, which were not only peppered with allusions to classics, Thucydides, Shakespeare, nor to the books written when he was a student, but consistently reworked to include cutting-edge research. The last time we met on Erev Hanukkah 2 years ago, I gave him a copy of Professor Gilligan's latest book. The book launch had been a few days earlier at NYU, and what stood out from his reaction was how excited he was to read it. His obituary in The Economist mentioned that he ran to Schubert and Beethoven, but it didn't say that he also ran to modern music, to Ed Sheeran, to Michael Jackson. He even had Eminem on his playlist, and he rapped Hamilton. He wanted to know the new. That flexibility and adaptability allowed him to be part and parcel of the university life, not just countless dialogues with speakers and university professors from numerous fields, which itself was integration to university life, but also the way he got involved in the life of students and Jewish life downtown. He wanted to meet with and serve as a resource to local rabbis. And when they met for the first time, it wasn't at a conference center or a shul, but it was at the Promenade Sports Bar in Gramercy, a location I had never thought of as a pub until Lady Elaine referred to it as such. He set aside a day each semester to meet with students, as many students as possible, and he always wanted them to pick the topic. He wanted to know what we were interested in. One Friday night, I brought over a group of law students to him and asked if he would join us to Zogel L'Chaim, and he not only toasted us and the Jewish commitment to law and justice, but he also took the time to stand with us, to tell jokes that were so perfectly appropriate and funny for a graduate student audience. NYU's Rabbi Yehuda Sarna has pointed out how frequently that Rabbi Sacks referenced what he called the jokey moments during his time at NYU, like his participation in the Purim spiel. And my fondest memory of this is at an NYU Parents Shabbat, in front of a packed room, he, Rabbi Sarna, and Rabbi Joe Wolfson formed a panel during the dessert. It was almost like they were based in. They took shilas, they took questions from the audience, which they answered each in turn with one word. The answer is, and I remember when one of them needed to play for time for a moment, one of them, instead of saying a word, just said, comma. And I could tell that Rabbi Sacks was just so enjoying the moment. I imagine that this was not something he did on most scholar in residence gigs or in so many places he was privileged to teach Torah, in Buckingham Palace, in the Vatican, your standard Orthodox shul in Britain, the US, wherever, anywhere really. And he embraced that role. He adapted from the formal role of the Lord to a member of the university community. When Rabbi Sachs would come to speak at the downtown minyan, Joanna would ask that I choose a member of our community to walk with him and Lady Elaine, either to or from shul. And what struck me about those occasions and others when I put people in direct contact with Rabbi Sachs was how immediately and quickly they would refer to their parents. My mother's going to shep nachas. I wish my father were alive to see this. Rabbi Sachs, a thinker who came into his most prominent during the era when we, as relatively young people, were emerging into adulthood, was flexible enough that he could use his words to appeal to our generation and to our parents' generation, and we all saw it as a zechut to be in his presence. I want to close with something I've written about elsewhere, our last individual meeting. For our last meeting during his professorship, I wanted to do something different. I wanted to simply learn Torah with him. I wanted to see how Rabbi Sachs approached a text so that I could gain insight into his methodology. And I chose a text from the Siddur, Atayat Sarta, which we say on Shabbos Rosh Chodesh, which Rabbi Sachs hadn't commented on in his commentary to the Siddur. And when he looked at the page, he said, you know, I've never really looked at this before. And I watched his mind spring into action. He looked at the paragraph, and suddenly he's picking out key words in the text, connecting them to Makorot in the Chumash, in Kabbalah, in the Gemara. And at one point, he excitedly gets up, runs to the door where Rabbi Joe Wolfson was sitting and says, Rabbi Wolfson, I need a sugya. I need a section of Talmud. It's in Masechet Chulin. I can't recall the precise page, but here are some quotes. And using Bar Ilan, we found it. The next thing I know, we're flying through this daf of Talmud on which he presented an entirely original reading. And the lens through which we studied that sugya and the original insights he had led to insights on the passage in the Siddur, which I might add, we only started to learn. The rest is for me to do because it was a lesson in learning how to learn. But the excitement, the joy in using the Gemara to interpret that paragraph was an element of that meeting that stays with me. And almost all of the anecdotes I've shared today talked about the joy he felt, especially in experiencing something new, engaging in something new, expanding his worldview. He wrote once that in Judaism, joy is the supreme religious emotion, that the miraculous ability to rejoice, even in the midst of suffering and pain, has been key to our survival, that the way we sing about our sins on Yom Kippur to a jolly tune is part of that, and that we needed less oi, more joy. Rabbi Sachs lived that joy. He conveyed it to us through his mastery of language, through his adaptability to the needs of the Jewish community which he served and to which he dedicated his life. He may have felt that Emunah was not something to philosophize about, but something to experience, even though he wrote about faith. And I believe that this was also true of joy. He wrote about joy, but joy was something he lived. May we learn from him what it means to be ma'aminim, people of faith, people who daven. After all, what is davening? The Gemara tells us that tefillah is avodah shebelev, service of the heart. And so when we engage in avodah, when we engage in service, may we follow in Rabbi Sachs's footsteps and meet the challenge of Sefer Tehillim, la'avod Hashem b'simcha, to serve God with gladness. May his memory be a blessing for us all.
Amen. I would like to thank all our speakers today, Dr. Tamra Wright, Rabbi Shaul Robinson, Rabbinit Leah Sarna, who has another engagement appointment, so she had to leave us at this moment, and Mr. Gabriel Slamovits, who really, I want to thank each and every one of you for your unique perspective, and also the wonderful, we bring together the Dorot, the different generations. I just want to close, and I want to thank also the International Rabbinic Fellowship led by Rabbi Saul Strasberg, who was a former student of mine, and also and all the officers for enthusiastically encouraging this program. And I want to thank everybody who came. This year, we also lost another giant of our modern Orthodox community, Rabbi Norman Lamb, Zichrono Livracha. And 35 years ago, I heard Rabbi Lamb, maybe even longer, citing the famous Gemara at the end of, I think, the first parak of Baba Kama. When Chizkiyahu HaMelech died, so the Gemara says, Hoshivu yeshiva al kivro. Literally, they set up a yeshiva on his kever, on his gravesite. And Rabbi Lamb took that homiletically to mean that in Judaism, when we commemorate someone, when we honor them, we don't simply build a monument. We don't build a museum, but rather, or a statue, but rather we We learn their teachings. Hoshivu yeshiva al kivro. We set up a yeshiva to teach us about Chizkiyahu HaMelech and his legacy. And today we had a small beginning that the legacy of Rabbi Sacks should be in his teaching and his impact. And we should continue to learn and take seriously his ideas and argue with his ideas, as Dr. Wright spoke about, that there are going to be many people who are going to write about tensions between pluralism and all those things that between the outside world and the internal Jewish world, and many other things that can be explored, and all the wonderful teachings that he brought to the world. We should be Meshiv Yeshiva al Kivro. This was the beginning, and it should continue forever. And we should Tehi Nishmatot Tzura B'Tzora Chaim. Thank you so much for everyone for participating, and have a wonderful and safe continual, I guess, winter and for the future.